Mills, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
We've spoken to many, many business leaders across our platform, and everyone says that it's this crazy pinch me moment when you go to a shop and you see your own product, or you see someone walking past with your book in hand or something like that. Do you ever kind of get over stuff like that?
I don't think so, no. There's something, I had this weird fixation for a while where like nothing got me more than when I'd see our products on the floor, as in, sorry, let me just explain that. When someone had clearly eaten them, and not that littering's a good thing, but you don't see loads of litter. So it was like, whoa, we've made it. We're officially.
Exactly, yeah. People eating our stuff are littering.
Which is quite bizarre. But no, there's something about it that's extraordinary. And it's funny because I've got two small kids, they're 3 and 4, or they would say 3.5 and 4.5. And now they do it too. And so every time we go into a shop, and because we're so widely available now, our brand, like any, like Sainsbury's Local, or something, Tesco's Express you go into, they're like, there's Deliciously Ella. They can't say the DE at the beginning of the Deliciously. And which I think has really exacerbated that pinch me, can't quite believe how surreal it is facet of it.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And we'll get into everything Deliciously Ella shortly. But you've mentioned it in many, many places, your story as to how you kind of ended up setting up the business. But if you could just kind of tell us, kind of leading up to Deliciously Ella, what that journey was like.
Yes, absolutely. And I'm definitely a totally accidental founder, which is the lesson from this story. I never thought I would start a business. I didn't really know what I wanted to do with my life in any shape or form. And I got very ill when I was at university. So this is back in 2011. And I spent the most of the next year in that hospital, seeing all sorts of different consultants, neurologists, gastroenterologists, endocrinologists, having all sorts of different treatments, tests, spending up to 10 days in hospital at any given moment. And I was diagnosed with a condition that affected the functioning of my autonomic nervous system. And I was put on about 25 different medications a day. And I was only 21 at this point. And no one promised that they would work, but I just assumed that they would, and someone else would solve my problem, essentially. And a year or so into taking all this medication, what became very clear was that wasn't the case, and it wasn't working for me. And my health, both mentally and physically, had hit a real rock bottom, and I was fundamentally unable to live a normal life. I would sleep 18 hours a day. I had chronic fatigue. I had brain fog. I mean, I felt so dizzy because I couldn't regulate my heart rate and my blood pressure properly that I felt like my head had been disconnected from my body. And all sorts of secondary complications with it as well. And it was really in hitting rock bottom that I started to internalize the solution a bit more and became interested in what else I could do. And it was through that I started reading other people's stories and looking at how other people had used facets of diet and lifestyle to change their health. And I thought, well, look, I don't have anything to lose at this point. If it's worked for them, maybe it will work for me. And that's what got me interested in the connection between what we eat and our health, and moving towards a whole food, plant-based diet. Couldn't cook, didn't really like vegetables, and couldn't find the recipes I needed. So I thought I'd do it myself. And Deliciously Ella was born, and it was meant to be a personal project. It wasn't meant to be the foundations of a business. But ultimately it ended up being a community, a premise, a mission, a brand, and that laid the foundations to form the business.
Yeah, I mean, when you look at it now, and obviously there's a whole ecosystem there, all kind of built into the community. I mean, was there kind of a moment throughout your journey that you kind of went, this is actually a big thing, I should be proud of it? Did you ever have that kind of moment of reflection?
Honestly, it's really taken me until now, until the last few months to feel that way. I think I was so young when I started Deliciously Ella. And as I said, I was never someone that was very ambitious. I was never someone that had really excelled at school and people had really high expectations for. I was distinctly average. And I only say that not to be self-deprecating, but because I think there's a lot of people, and particularly women, who feel the same way. They were never the standout person. Could they really achieve what they want to achieve? And I think this combination of never feeling like I could do something potentially that was a little bit different, and not knowing what I wanted to do in my life and not having huge self-confidence, coupled with the extraordinary toll, particularly mentally, that being ill had taken on me, and this massive swipe to my self-esteem. I think I had so much imposter syndrome. And then because I was so young when I started the business, I think it was very difficult to be taken seriously in any capacity. And so it was the combination of those things that I think made me consistently feel like I had to prove myself to people. And there was an element of knowing that people were to some extent waiting for me to fail. And whenever we did and we got things wrong, as everybody does in any business, there was a sort of sometimes a sense of celebration around that, which was an interesting thing to learn to navigate. But now I look at it and I think I felt I needed sort of almost concrete evidence that the business really was successful and it had stood an element of the test of time. You know, it's been 9 years since we really started setting up the business in its current guise. We've sold over 90 million products since we launched them in 2016. We now sell product every second. We're in all the mainstream retailers. So I do feel, I look at the data of our sales and look, don't get me wrong, there's areas to improve on, but then there's other areas where we are outselling all our competitors who are owned by conglomerates and have multi-million-pound marketing budgets. And I post about what we do on social media. And so I look at that and I think, wow, doing it differently has worked and is working. And I genuinely now feel super, super proud of what I started and what we collectively as a team have built.
I want to go back to kind of those early years when you're building it. And like you said, you've got people almost not hoping for you to fail, but almost waiting for you to fail. We had an incredible discussion a few years ago with Jacqueline Gold, who, of course, was the chairperson of Ann Summers and did incredible things. And her dad was seen as this great businessman, the figurehead, and she was kind of this add-on. That's what most people kind of thought. And she very quickly said, like, my dad bought West Ham because of me. She was very, very quick to quite rightly point that out. And I mean, obviously for yourself, you've got your dad's a politician, and on your mother's side, it's kind of the Sainsbury's family from the supermarket chain. I mean, did you feel that you had not more pressure, but you had to prove people wrong? Did it almost give you a chip on your shoulder when you kind of in those early years? Did you think about that?
Yeah, no, I think absolutely. And look, I don't blame people for thinking that I needed to prove myself either. I really don't. And I think when anybody starts something so young and, there's always reality and great headlines are often removed. And, no one in my mum's family have worked in the business for decades and decades. It went public when she was a teenager. I mean, there is no relationship between us and Sainsbury's, hasn't been since before I was born. But ultimately, it's a good story, isn't it? And so I think how people perceive it and what it actually looks like are very, very different. And actually, they were one of the last retailers to list us, and can be sometimes a little bit challenging. So, which is always quite ironic, but I definitely felt that 100%. I think it was the combination of all of those things. And I very, very much wanted to do it on my own. I'm probably I wouldn't say I'm a stubborn person, but I do like to do things my own way. I've always been like that since I was a child. My mum would say, "Did you come and pick me up from nursery school or something?" And all the kids would be painting and I would be in the sandpit by myself. All those sorts of things I've just never really minded. Everyone else liked to go to parties when they're teenagers. I never did. I used to sit at home by myself and watch X Factor. Like a really cool kid. But I've always wanted to do things my own way. And so I think when I was starting the business, I didn't want help from anybody. I didn't want anybody else involved. I wanted to prove, I think, to everybody else just as much as myself that I could do this.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And obviously it starts as what then was a blog. It kind of grows. And then a few years later, you release your book. We've had Casper Lee, the former YouTuber, now VC. He wrote a column for Business Leader recently, and he said the problem with people who have a following is that sometimes they've almost got a false economy, if you will, of people, a false sense of traction was the wording that he used. When you kind of went to release your book and subsequently all the incredible things that you've done, obviously opening restaurants and cafes and things like that, was there ever a moment that you kind of thought similar to him? You're kind of like, oh, is this actually gonna work? And how quickly does that kind of wear off?
Yeah, look, it's a really interesting conversation that he's having. I would say taking this with a pinch of salt, I feel like we've had the opposite experience. But I think the world of social media is deeply nuanced. It's complex, isn't it? And I think it depends what you do, right? Delicious Cielo from day one was a platform to talk about plant-based food. It's never been about me. And I think some people, when they hear that on the surface, are like, oh, but your face is on the cover of the book, or like, I'll see you cooking the recipe. But the video might have 0.7 seconds of me in it. I mean, I've always seen myself as more of a conduit of the information to the person, a friendly way of making it feel accessible and relatable and interesting versus it's about me. If you follow Delicious Yellow devoutly, you still probably don't actually know anything about me, other than the fact that I have 2 children and I work with my husband and I really like cooking broccoli. Really outside of that, you don't know anything about me. And that's a really deliberate strategy. Delicious Yellow has always been about this mission of getting people cooking real food again, eating more plants more of the time. And so I think as a result, because that audience are there for a very, very specific reason, they are there for the resources that we've created since day one, it translates to sales pretty seamlessly. Whereas I think what we've also seen is influencers where it's a personal brand about that influencer and you're much more interested in their personal life and who they're dating and where they're going to restaurants and what kind of clothes they're buying. And if they start a company that's slightly removed from that, ultimately those people aren't necessarily there because you're going to sell them a snack bar. They've never engaged in your food content. That's not why they follow your page, for example. Not that he started a food company, but I think that's probably sometimes where that gap is. And so I do think it's true. I think just like raising money isn't a shortcut to success. Certainly I don't believe that it is. I don't think that having a lot of followers is a shortcut to success. It's ultimately with all of these things, it's how smartly to some degree are you using them? Like how niche is it? How connected is it to a common ground and authenticity and a credibility that consumers come on that journey with you?
Yeah, no, absolutely. That's a great point. And again, we've kind of spoken about the app, the books, the product range. There's a lot that Deliciously Elliot does. And, people who may be watching this, or our key audience is kind of medium-sized businesses who are growing. And I think a concern that a lot of them have is kind of spreading themselves a little bit too thin. So kind of doing too much, releasing one more product than they can handle. Was that ever kind of a concern for you as far as watering down the brand, and how did you kind of overcome that?
Yeah, look, that's a really good and very fair question. And I would say our concern has never been watering down the brand, because all of those facets speak to the mission of getting people eating more plants more often. It's more the resources and how well can you actually execute, follow through, with so many different facets. And so I own the business with my husband. He's the CEO. I'm the brand director. And we've been working together since 2015. And when we first started, and we met through the premise of building a snack bar together. So this is our whole relationship. But when we first started looking at this, we, went take advice from people and talk to as many people as we could. And the advice was universally, this is a terrible idea. Don't do it. Don't do lots of different things. And it's sage advice in so many different ways. I definitely don't disagree with what we were told. But equally, I think there's a few different facets of it. But I think one thing we looked at is that ultimately, we're in plant-based and we're in natural, and the space around that is growing incredibly fast at the moment. When we started, it was sub 5% of consumers bought into the plant-based category. It's now about 48%, so we're seeing really exciting growth, and our audience is obviously expanding. But nonetheless, it was a small audience on day one, and we didn't feel we could scale a really big business on one specific product at that point. We'd also started as a content first brand. And so we had just as much permission to make soups as we did to make a natural ready meal, as we did to make a snack, because consumers knew us through our recipe books and through our social media content, which covered every moment of every day. And it felt that we were highly unique as a brand to be able to play on that. And that's a real USP. And in terms of the matrix, again, that was really deliberate because we've never had any capital in the business. We had investors in for 4 years and they owned sub 20% of the brand. It was a cash flow issue that we brought them in to help us with, and because we were growing really fast, and we bought them out in 2021. And so we've never had a marketing budget. I mean, we still have a marketing budget of what feels like about £3. At the best month, it feels like 6. But, we don't have any money to spend. We've never done an above the line campaign. We've done our first digital marketing in the last 6 months, which is why I don't believe that capital is the route to success. Now, I'm not saying we couldn't be better. I'm not saying we couldn't grow faster. But as I said, like, we look at the data now where we outsell brands that will launch at the same time with us with a multi-million-pound marketing campaign, and we will go in ahead of them in terms of rate of sale. That's a really interesting proof point that actually this 360 matrix is deeply unconventional, but creating an emotional connection with our audience where we actually become a part of their life. And so everything is content marketing, whether that's the cookbooks, where essentially we get paid for our marketing activity and we get an extraordinary amount of press and we get this amazing ability to talk about the mission and getting people cooking more plants, and we get into people's homes and into their minds there. Then you're talking to your colleague about the recipe that you cooked. Then you go to Tesco and you see our bar on the shelf and you trust us, you believe in us. And so I think that's how we look at it, is that ultimately, to make a big enough market at the moment, it feels like we need multiple products. We're highly unique and incredibly being able to play so much across category, and it felt that we should take advantage of that, really. And also, I think it did feel like that as a marketing strategy was very interesting around using all these different levers to create this matrix, essentially, where you really deeply become a part of people's lives and they are real brand fans and carry what we do.
I think that organic growth and, like you said, that marketing ecosystem that you've got is so brilliant. And, the one thing that I kind of doing the research heard you talk about was the fact about slimmer margins, which you make compared to other companies who may have preservatives and all kinds of stuff that's just not natural. I'm intrigued, again, coming back to the kind of funding side of stuff. When you were having those discussions with the investors, I bet you had people who were like, well, just hike up the price, let's get our money back kind of thing. And why did you kind of stay so true to your original kind of vision for the company? Were those conversations that you had?
Oh, yeah, no, absolutely. We've had variations on those conversations consistently throughout the lifetime of the business. The one thing which this is 100% credit to Matthew, my husband, business partner on this, is he said from day one, we're going to run a financially sustainable business. He feels, and I don't disagree with him, that the skill in business is creating a profitable business. Ultimately, like, if you're losing money left, right, and center, there is, to some degree, it's an easier job. And he felt very passionately that it needed to be financially sustainable as a business. And we didn't want to spend our whole life reliant on other people. And also, to that point, when we started, and we did obviously contemplate raising money, we had this exciting brand. There was clearly this massive white space opportunity in retail to scale a natural brand, and plant-based was growing equally. But it was so clear that this was such a niche mission at this point. The world has changed and the food landscape has changed so much in the last decade that talking about natural food, less ultra-processed food, not using emulsifiers is becoming very commonplace, but it really wasn't when we were looking at this at its conception point a decade ago. And it was so clear that people would consistently want us to compromise, and that would lose all credibility in the brand. And that wasn't the point. The point was to change the food landscape and be a part of that. And so we didn't want to, but it is a consistent challenge because we want to sell natural premium products at mainstream prices so that we can sell in every retailer. And ultimately, of course, that's more expensive and more complicated than if you're using a flavoring to create the flavor versus natural food. And so that undoubtedly leaves us with challenge. And because we want to run a financially sustainable business, something has to give. And ultimately, it's the marketing margin basically that comes out. And that's why it's all organic and it's all content-led marketing.
Yeah, no, I just... the way that you've done it is just brilliant. And, you've mentioned, obviously, your partner a few times. How important is it to have Matthew as kind of that sounding board for each of you to kind of be like, this is a decision we need to make, we can make it together? Just talk about that partnership a little bit. Yeah,
no, absolutely. I mean, look, I think partnerships can make or break things, can't they? They can be absolutely phenomenal, and you'll hear people waxing lyrical about how it's the best thing that's ever happened to their business. And equally, obviously, we've all heard however many horror stories about actually when partnerships don't work. It's incredibly difficult, particularly when you have a close relationship going into it. I think for us, it's probably that, I say classic story. I'm not sure if it's a classic story, but it's really founder meets entrepreneur. And I think that's where the sweet spot has been for us, is ultimately I am very much a founder. I don't think I would have started 100 other businesses. I don't think if I was doing Delicious Yellow, I would start, X many others. It's all about, I care so deeply about the mission, about making this impact in the food landscape, about why we do what we do and executing that and following through on it. And he is one of those people that would look at absolutely anything, like whatever comes across his path any given day, and would have however many ideas of interesting things that he could do with that business. And every time he looks at a business, he has 10 ideas of things that's just the way that his brain works and what gets him really excited. And so I think that's really been the beauty. We have essentially enabled each other to do so much more in our careers as a result of the sort of divide and conquer element. Equally, you share that deep sense of pressure and stress and total unwavering understanding of what the other person is going through. And ultimately, for us, just like for almost every single business in this country, the last few years have been, really difficult. It's not been an easy landscape now for, a solid 4 years, which is a long time to navigate the various different lockdowns, Brexit, hyperinflation. We've had cost price increases across the board, and that has obviously taken its toll. It really does, particularly when you stretch it out over such a long period of time. And I don't speak to any other founder or CEO who hasn't had similar challenges, but being in it together, albeit sometimes it means you never escape the bubble of it. It is really amazing having that level of support. And the business wouldn't be what it is today without both of us. I think one other thing I would say on partnership quickly, though, is I think the secret to partnership is doing completely different things. Ultimately, you have to have autonomy, right, in the way that you execute your day to day. And when you're a tiny startup and there's 6 of you in the room, no one really has a job. You technically have a job title, but you all do everything. But at this point, I think having very clear dividing lines between what you're all in charge of is absolutely critical. And I think when it goes wrong is when ultimately you both want to make the same decisions. Of course, there's a level of objectivity and subjectivity that come into this. And when ultimately it's a subjective decision and you disagree, if you're doing that all day, every day, you will drive each other insane and the partnership isn't going to work. So I think if you are going to have a partner, which I do really believe in, because it allows you to some extent to do more and be more focused, it has to be that your skill sets and your interests and where you want to spend your time within the business is quite separately to one another. But in terms of mentorship, it's actually not something that either of us have actually ever had. I think we hired some really brilliant people into the business really, really quickly. And I guess in a way it has been that consistent team and where we have lent on each other for the decision making and the experience. And I think, as we've talked about, we have done things very differently, I would say. If I look at most of our counterparts, we haven't taken a kind of conventional private equity route or, even from a marketing perspective, etc. It has been quite a different way of building a business. And so I think there have been moments where it's not that other people's advice isn't valid. It's very valid. And gosh, it's important to know what you don't know. And we don't know lots of things. And we've got lots and lots of things wrong. But equally, I think because we were trying to create different types of products, using different types of ingredients in different ways across store, using totally different brand awareness strategies, it did feel like sometimes, even if other people had a completely extraordinary experience, the way they built what they built was so different from what we were doing. That the crossover didn't always feel as relevant, whereas the people who we'd hired into the business who were absolutely brilliant and had brilliant experience knew all the nuances of it. And so I think sometimes that advice was more powerful.
No, that's a really, really great point. And the other thing I want to kind of come on to is international expansion, because that's something that you've done so brilliantly. I believe Austria was a fairly new expansion for you. You're in a number of countries. As far as picking out those countries to expand to and those partners, How did those relationships start? Where did you even begin those conversations? Can you just kind of give us a little bit of a background to that?
Yeah, and international expansion is something we've done probably slower than we potentially would have because of all the implications of COVID, of Brexit, which again, I think across the board have made things infinitely more complex. But also again, because we don't have masses of budget to play with, entering new markets obviously can be very expensive. And we have a level of brand awareness in the UK that we don't have to the same degree in any other market. And so we've done it relatively slowly and relatively cautiously. And oftentimes, and again, this is where to our conversation just now, in terms of us doing it a bit differently, because we do have a slightly outsized brand reach and awareness versus actually the size of business we are at this point, it's meant that oftentimes actually people have come to us. So most of the countries we're in, it's because the retailers have come to us because they want to expand their plant base and they see us as a leader and a credible brand to put in to show their credentials within this area. So actually that's been a lot of the decision making for us. Now, obviously, if it was totally the wrong strategy at the wrong point in definitely the wrong market, we're not doing it. But then there's places, as you said, for example, like Austria, probably wouldn't have been at the very top of our list of countries to expand into. Post Ireland, we're in Switzerland, but a lot of this has actually been people coming to us, and that was a very large retailer in Austria, one of the main grocers there, who want to expand their plant-based reach, and they want the credibility of brands that they feel really speak to the consumer, to give them that authenticity in that space.
Yeah, no, definitely. And safe to say, there's no plain sailing when you're running a business. And, people, when they think about failure in business, it's not necessarily a catastrophic, we're going to close down as an operation, but it's almost micro failures like, closing locations or something like that. And those are very, very difficult failures to deal with, especially when there's external factors going on and things like that. How have you managed those difficult times, those technically failures? And, has there anything that's kind of grounded you, any tips for people who may be going through something similar?
Yeah, it's a great question. And look, I don't think anybody doesn't fail. And I think that's a really important point. And I think, as you're saying, it's not that these failures are necessarily totally catastrophic. But I think they can be if you don't acknowledge them. And I think that's probably, for me, the biggest learning and the biggest piece of advice is that everybody makes the wrong decisions at points. We've looked at stuff and we think this is going to be a great product. Like, we look at all the category data, we feel this is a white space opportunity, nobody buys it. And it's off shelf within the year. Look, that's happened to us. That happens to everybody. It's just a part of growing. But I think the quicker you acknowledge you got that wrong, this is not working, stop pushing water up a hill, and lean into what is working, pivot, change, evolve, that idea of failing forward. I think the quicker you can acknowledge that, the better, most definitely. And I think that's sometimes the biggest challenge, is that particularly when you care so deeply about what you're doing, which most founders do, obviously, you're pretty embedded in what you've decided is the right thing to do. So you almost just keep throwing like fuel on the fire, and you digging a deeper and deeper hole because you so want to prove that your decision was the right one, when fundamentally it wasn't. And so I guess there's the acknowledging the fact that it's an inevitable part of growth. And I think I love the idea that the best businesses aren't necessarily the best ideas or the best product. What they actually are is the person or the group of people who've got up the most times and solved the most number of problems the most quickly, because every business is riddled with challenge and issues and problems. And as you said, micro failures, small failures. And the quicker you pivot, the quicker you acknowledge, the quicker you're able to sort of dissolve any semblance of ego or attachment to what you think was the right thing to do, the better. But that's not an easy thing to do. And I think it gets easier as you grow, because now we look at things and we think, this is working brilliantly, this is working brilliantly, this has got legs, this needs work, but it's okay. These are disasters. And it's much easier to cut your disasters because you believe in so much of the rest of it and you have such proof point of the rest of it. Whereas I think in the early stages, that is more challenging because ultimately you're trying to prove yourself, your brand, your business across the board. And so, first failures, I think, are much more difficult than later ones.
Yeah. And again, kind of sticking on that early part of the journey, another thing that a lot of people struggle with as they're kind of going from the smaller business to more the medium-sized business is, I was in the kitchen making everything before I was in charge of the marketing. And suddenly you have to just give less and less, control. You have less and less control of your own kind of company, your own brand. How have you felt that as it's kind of scaled up? Because obviously you can't be in all these places doing all these things at once. How have you felt that kind of being stretched and having to let things go?
Yeah, look, it's not easy. I definitely haven't found it easy. And also there was this strange inflection point where you do really realize that, like, because I said earlier, Delicious Yellow's never been about me. It hasn't. It was never about my life. It was about a way of cooking and a way of looking at food. But ultimately, it was such a massive part of my life. It brought me my health back. It was, I threw everything into it. And, when you're a very small team, it was to some degree a kind of like pseudonym, and it was a huge identity point. And then there's this moment where other people are talking about you and about the brand and your role as founder, and it's this sort of divorcing of the fact that you aren't the business anymore. You work for the business just as much as any other team member. Is certainly how I think we both see it in the company. And that was an interesting inflection point where you have to take a step back and realize, like, this is a shared business. This isn't me and my vision anymore, and other people's opinions are very valid, and sometimes I'm wrong and I don't see it in the right way. And so that's really interesting because you're so personally connected to it in those early stages, and taking a step back is really challenging. And I think there is then this next moment. I always felt it was interesting as you moved from kind of like 12 to 15 people beyond that, because under 15 people, you don't really need process. Everyone is sort of working in one room as one living, breathing organism. And then you get to this sort of teenage phase at 25 people where you don't know everybody inside out. Not everybody's in every meeting. They don't have all the information, and people are starting to make these decisions, but you don't have all the processes in place to make sure everything's signed off. And that felt like almost one of the biggest learning curves. And I think, look at the team now, and there's no other way to run it other than giving people huge amounts of autonomy. And I do feel very protective, but very removed at the same time from being Delicious Yellow, from it being all about what I think. And ultimately, I look at it and I think my role really as the founder in so many ways is being the guardian of the brand. Are we staying true to the reason we've always been successful? Are we pushing that forward? Are we staying true to what our consumers see us as, to all the different flexes in the market and the way that people are looking at this space? Yeah, are we championing the mission in the correct way? Do we look right, taste right, etc.? As opposed to feeling like it's my job to make sure all of those things happen.
Transition to guardian. I love that. That's brilliant. Talking about yourself personally, you've spoken so openly in the past about your problems with your self-esteem, depression, physical and mental health. Those are incredibly difficult things to manage as people are looking to you to have all the answers. And, in your case, you're on social media, you're in the press, you're all over the place. How have you managed to get everything under control? I believe your morning routine is part of that, but do you have any tips? I know it's not a one size fits all thing, but for people who may be struggling with things and running a business, do you have any tips to kind of help people through?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. As you said, there isn't a one size fits all, definitely not. And I don't think there is even for anyone as an individual, because life changes and therefore what you need in any given day, week, month, year changes as well. And I think you have to give yourself space for that to flex. But I do think, running a business, growing a business, it really takes its toll. It's so relentless. It often feels like you're just consistently needing to like pull a rabbit out of a hat, and you have to stay upbeat and you have to stay positive and you have to keep that momentum going even when you don't have anything left to give. And it's also like consistent mini burnouts, I think. And I think that's incredibly common. And so taking care of yourself is so important. And I think it's so easy to put it at the bottom of the list because you've got so much else to do and so much else to get on with. But equally, it is so critical to success is you being on your best possible form. And so I think I try and take that, quite for want of a better word, seriously now, and really making sure I've made time for well-being practices. And as you said, a lot of that for me is creating a morning routine, because I just don't know what the rest of the day entails. Problems come out of nowhere, things change in an instant, and that's always been the case. That doesn't mean it happens every day, but it just means things run away from you very quickly, and you're kind of stuck for time all day, every day, and we end up working late most evenings. And then, as I said, I've got 2 small children, so sometimes you spend 2 hours being screamed at before you even get to the office, so it can be quite a cycle. And so carving out that time first thing in the morning, where nobody is vying for your attention, no one wants anything from you, it's actually your time. And there's something about that I find very impactful. So we do try and have 45 minutes, an hour every morning. I do a meditation, drink coffee very quietly, get ready for the day. And I think it creates a sense of grounding, even when things feel incredibly overwhelming.
It's now time for a very special segment. We've teamed up with the Dando News Centre to bring you the Good News postcard. Ella, today your question comes from Kira, aged 11.
Hello, my name is Kira and I've got a question for you. If you could be a superhero for one day, who would you be and what power would you have?
What a great question, Kira. Now, I have to admit something. I don't really know the superheroes, but I do know what power I would have, so I hope that's okay. I would love to be able to click my fingers or do something similar and just be anywhere that I wanted to be in the world. So I guess it's time travel. I think time is the biggest challenge in my life, and it means that I often don't see friends, family, people that I love anywhere near as much as I would like to. So I would love to be able to click my fingers and go and spend half an hour with my mum or my siblings, some of which live quite far away, or friends who live on the other side of the world who I don't really get to see, or even just to click my fingers and go home for half an hour and see my kids, sometimes when work gets really busy. So that would be my superpower.
That is a brilliant answer to a brilliant question. Thank you very much. Our last question for you. Obviously, we are business leaders. So what to you makes a great business leader?
Oh, there's so much in there. I think it's a couple of things, which I'm not sure if I'm allowed to have. I think there is an element of vulnerability and humility that I think is absolutely essential. I think you are no different to everybody else that works in the business. And I think that, to me, is something that's very important. And I think, as we talked about in terms of failures, you will make decisions that are incorrect and that are essentially failures, or lead to failures. And you need to be so happy to admit that, and to park any sense of ego, and to be really humble in the way that you approach it. And I think sometimes that's difficult when you care really passionately about it and you so want it to work. You feel you've kind of put your life on the line for this to succeed. But I think, as much as possible, dissolving any sense of ego or I'm right, or sort of barrier, for me is incredibly important. And I think it's also just that consistent knowing that it will be really difficult, it will be really turbulent, there will be infinite number of challenges along the way, but that is just a part of it. And no one has it any differently. So it's almost to expect it to be incredibly challenging, to be humble and willing to fail fast and fail forward consistently along the way, and know why you're doing what you do. I think a good leader takes people on a journey, and you've got to consistently remember what journey you're trying to take people on.